One of the most feared military commanders and leaders of his time, Napoleon Bonaparte, came from humble beginnings to become a man who was feared all Europe over. He would, through his control of the military, become the Emperor of the French, but he would be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Following this, he was exiled to a remote island known as St Helena in the Atlantic, and some historians have claimed that Napoleon's treatment in exile at the hands of the British and the Allies was part of his death. But what did Napoleon die of, and what happened in his final moments? Join us as we look at this, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Napoleon Bonaparte would become one of the most successful generals of the French revolutionary armies, and he would later become emperor. But he was educated at a military school in France as a young man, and following this he then joined the army, and following the French Revolution he rose throughout the ranks. The French Revolution was a period of huge change across the country, as thousands were executed on devices such as the guillotine, and even the French king and queen went to their deaths on the guillotine. It was a time of great bloodshed, where many prominent politicians also rose briefly before they fell from grace, and men such as Robespierre also lost their heads. But Napoleon continued to rise throughout the army, and he would become the commander of the French army, and he would then try to mess with the British. He targeted their trade routes, especially with India, and he would conquer Egypt in 1798, even though the British destroyed the fleet where he landed in what was known as the Battle of the Nile. When he came back to France, Napoleon was a national hero, and he became the first consul of France, and then in 1804 would later accept the title of emperor. He had in the years before further consolidated his military strength, as he would defeat the Austrians in 1800 at the Battle of Marengo, and would show the French power and dominate over others in Europe. Because of this, the only other opponent that he would try to fight against was the British, who were very concerned about his power, and with being close to France, the British were quite worried. In France, the Peace of Amiens would be signed in 1802, which marked an end of the French Revolutionary War. But Britain then would agree to return territory to the Spanish, Dutch and French, but this treaty would not be worth much, as the British refused to evacuate Malta, and Napoleon would not give the independence to the Dutch. Britain would then declare war on the French again, then Austria and Russia would follow suit. But Napoleon planned to invade England in 1804, placing 150,000 men and 2,000 ships at Boulogne, with the thought of crossing the English Channel. His plan was to distract the Royal Navy and to get them to chase the French ships, when the troops would then cross and invade. But the British learned about what was going to happen, and they would then attack the French fleet, led by Vice Admiral Villeneuve. But the British forced the fleet to retreat from the Channel, and Napoleon then thought twice about invading Britain. The British would continue to attack, and they attacked the fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, but Napoleon was more bothered at the time on attacking the Austrian and Russian soldiers, and he would later defeat them. But he also defeated the Prussians, and he managed to expand the lands the French had, and he would be holding much land across Europe, and was quite clearly dominating Europe. However, it was now time, in his opinion, to stop the British, and Napoleon wanted to stop their trade across Europe, but at the time there was resistance in Portugal and Spain to the French occupation. The British, who were led by the Duke of Wellington, started to make gains on the Iberian Peninsula, and Napoleon then, with his empire stretched, would take heavy losses following the Russian campaign. He was then later defeated at Leipzig also, and he then abdicated, being exiled. But then he would come back to power and prepared once more for battle with the British. But he then attempted to try and retake power, but this failed, especially after the French defeat at the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June 1815. But following this, Napoleon would then be sent to exile 5,000 miles from Europe, on the island of St Helena. He was kept there by the British following his surrender, and he was first kept for 2 months at Briar's Pavilion, before he was then moved to the Longwood House, which was a large wooden bungalow. The house itself was rather ruinous, and it was not in the best state, and it was very damp, and it wasn't the healthiest place for someone to spend long periods of time. Napoleon believed that the British were trying to hasten his death, and he would then complain of his conditions and treatment, and he said he had many colds, catarrhs, damp floors and poor provisions. But others have claimed that from the copper arsenide in the wallpaper that he had contracted arsenic poisoning. His expenses were also cut by the British, and he would spend the rest of his life playing card games, writing and entertaining whoever and whenever he could. There was no serious escape attempt because he was so far away, and he would live out the rest of his life inside of the house. His doctor complained that his declining health was caused by the treatment and imprisonment, and in the last few years of his life, Napoleon stayed for long periods of time inside the mould-infested house. It was a little bit of a death trap. He was lonely and isolated, but in February 1821, Napoleon's health deteriorated very quickly. He then the following month became very bedbound, and he would not leave his bedroom, and he would die on the 5th of May 1821 at Longwood House. He was just 51, and he then made his last confession, and his final words were, "France the army, the head of the army, Josephine." An autopsy was carried out on his body, and a death mask was created and cast off his face, as was compulsory with the French at the time. His heart and intestines were then removed during the embalming process, and these were then placed in a sealed vessel that was then placed in his coffin at his feet. He had asked to be buried on the banks of the River Seine, but later in 1840, 20 years after his death, permission was obtained to take his casket back to France. To begin with, the coffin and casket was opened, and Napoleon at the time, like I said, had been dead 2 decades, but Napoleon's remains had been well preserved and had not allegedly decomposed at all. A state funeral would take place 20 years after his death, and his remains were then entombed at the Les Invalides in Paris. It's believed that the cause of Napoleon's death may have been a stomach ulcer or stomach cancer that was in his family, or that he may have been slowly exposed to arsenic poisoning. From analysing samples of his hair, it was found that he had 100 times the average level of arsenic for someone in his hair, and they claim that this may have been the real cause and fatal cause of his death. But he was a feared and brutal military leader who would become the most powerful man across Europe, and was a thorn in the sides of many militaries across the continent. He made a number of bad decisions though in his final years, but he lived out the last of his days inside a house on a remote island, thousands of miles away from his home, and because of this he was at the behest of the British, who had defeated him and who captured him and left him to rot. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.